I'm okay. You're okay. By Thomas A. Harris, MD. Preface. In recent years there have been many reports of a growing impatience with psychiatry, with its seeming foreverness, its high cost, its debatable results, and its vague, esoteric terms. To many people it is like a blind man in a dark room looking for a black cat that isn't there. The magazines and mental health associations say psychiatric treatment is a good thing, but what it is or what it accomplishes has not been made clear. Although hundreds of thousands of words about psychiatry are consumed by the public yearly, there has been little convincing data to help a person in need of treatment overcome the cartoon image of psychiatrists and their mystical couches. Impatience has been expressed with increasing concern not only by patients and the general public but by psychiatrists as well. I am one of these psychiatrists. This book is the product of a search to find answers for people who are looking for hard facts in answer to their questions about how the mind operates, why we do what we do, and how we can stop doing what we do if we wish. The answer lies in what I feel is one of the most promising breakthroughs in psychiatry in many years. It is called transactional analysis. It has given hope to people who have become discouraged by the vagueness of many of the traditional types of psychotherapy. It has given a new answer to people who want to change rather than to adjust, to people who want transformation rather than conformation. It is realistic in that it confronts the patient with the fact that he is responsible for what happens in the future no matter what has happened in the past. Moreover, it is enabling persons to change, to establish self-control and self-direction, and to discover the reality of a freedom of choice. For the development of this method we are preeminently indebted to Dr. Eric Berne, who, in developing the concept of transactional analysis, has created a unified system of individual and social psychiatry that is comprehensive at the theoretical level and effective at the applied level. It has been my privilege to study with Berne for the past 10 years and to share the discussions of the advanced seminar in San Francisco which he conducts. I first became acquainted with Berne's new method of treatment through a paper that he presented at the Western Regional Meeting of the American Group Psychotherapy Association in Los Angeles in November 1957. It was entitled Transactional Analysis, a New and Effective Method of Group Therapy. I was convinced that this was not just another paper, but indeed a blueprint of the mind, which no one had constructed before, along with a precision vocabulary, which anybody could understand, to identify the parts of the blueprint. This vocabulary has made it possible for two people to talk about behavior and know what is meant. Page 5. One difficulty with many psychoanalytic words is that they do not have the same meanings for everybody. The word ego, for instance, means many things to many people. Freud had an elaborate definition, as has nearly every psychoanalyst since his time, but these long, complicated constructions are not particularly helpful to a patient who is trying to understand why he can never hold a job, particularly if one of his problems is that he cannot read well enough to follow instructions. There is not even agreement by theoreticians as to what ego means. Vague meanings and complicated theories have inhibited more than helped the treatment process. Herman Melville observed that a man of true science uses but few hard words, and those only when none other will answer his purpose, whereas the smatterer in science thinks that by mouthing hard words he understands hard things. The vocabulary of transactional analysis is the precision tool of treatment because, in a language anyone can understand, it identifies things that really are, the reality of experiences that really happened in the lives of people who really existed. Also the method, which is particularly suited to the treatment of people in groups, points to an answer to the great disparity between the need for treatment and the trained people available to do the work. During the past 25 years, beginning with particular intensity in the years immediately following World War II, the popularity of psychiatry would seem to have created expectancies far beyond our capacity to fulfill them. Continual outpourings of psychological literature, whether printed in psychiatric journals or the Reader's Digest, have increased this expectancy yearly, but the chasm between this and cure seems to have widened. The question has always been how to get Freud off the couch and to the masses. The challenge to psychiatry to meet this need was expressed by Mike Gorman, the executive director of the National Committee Against Mental Illness, in an address to the annual meeting of the American Psychiatric Association in New York in May 1965. As you have escalated from a small cell of some 3,000 psychiatrists in 1945 to a large specialty organization with 14,000 members in 1965, you have of necessity been increasingly drawn into participation in the major issues of our time. You can no longer hide in the discomfort of your private office, appropriately fitted with an overstuffed couch and a picture of Freud visiting Worcester, Massachusetts, in 1909. I submit that psychiatry must develop a public language, decontaminated of technical jargon and suited to the discussion of universal problems of our society. I realize that this is a very difficult task. It means taking leave of the comfortable, secure, and protected words of the profession and adjusting to the much breezier dialogue of the open tribunal. As difficult as this task is, it must be done if psychiatry is to be heard in the civic halls of our nation. Page 6. I am heartened by the recent writings of a number of young psychiatrists which demonstrate a healthy aversion to spending an entire professional life treating 10 to 20 patients a year. The comment of the psychiatrist Dr. Melvin Sabshin is typical. One simple question is whether or not psychiatry can accomplish these new functions or roles by utilizing its traditional skills, its standard methodology, and its current practices. My own answer to the question is no. I believe these do not provide an adequate basis for new functions and configurations. Psychiatry must face up to the fact that it cannot begin to meet the demands for psychological and social help from the poor, the underachieving in our schools, the frustrated among our blue-collar workers, the claustrophobic residents in our crowded cities, and so on almost ad infinitum. Many of its most thoughtful leaders are giving increasing thought to the new role which psychiatry must play the next several decades, in not only broadening its own parochial training, but in joining with other behavioral disciplines on an equal footing in establishing training programs for the thousands upon thousands of new mental health workers we will need if we are to achieve the goals which President Kennedy proclaimed in his historic 1963 mental health message. 1. Training programs of thousands of mental health workers in a public language, decontaminated of technical jargon and suited to the discussion of universal problems in our society is being made possible today by transactional analysis. More than 1,000 professionals have been trained in this method in the state of California, and this training is spreading rapidly to other parts of the country and to foreign countries. About one half of these professionals are psychiatrists, the other half includes medical doctors of other specialties, obstetrics, pediatrics, internal medicine, general practice, psychologists, social workers, probation officers, nurses, teachers, personnel managers, clergymen, and judges. Transactional analysis is now being used in group treatment in many of California's state hospitals, prisons, and youth authority institutions. It is used by increasing numbers of therapists in marital counseling, treatment of adolescents and pre-adolescents, pastoral counseling, and family-centered obstetrical care, and in at least one institution for the mentally retarded, Laurel Hills of Sacramento. A central reason why transactional analysis offers such promise for filling the gap between need for and supply of treatment is that it works at its best in groups. It is a teaching and learning device rather than a confessional or an archaeological exploration of the psychic cellars. In my private practice of psychiatry, this has made possible the treatment of 4 times as many patients as before. During the past 25 years in my work as a psychiatrist, in the treatment of patients and in the administration of large institutional programmers, nothing has excited me so much as what is happening today in my practice. One of the most significant contributions of transactional analysis is that it has given patients a tool they can use. The purpose of this book is to define this tool. Anybody can use it. People do not have to be sick to benefit from it. Page 7. It is a profoundly rewarding experience to see people begin to change from the first treatment hour, get well, grow, and move out of the tyranny of the past. We base our even greater hope on the affirmation that what has been can be again. If the relationship between two people can be made creative, fulfilling, and free of fear, then it follows that this can work for two relationships, or 3 or 100 or, we are convinced, for relationships that affect entire social groups, even nations. The problems of the world, and they are chronicled daily in headlines of violence and despair, essentially are the problems of individuals. If individuals can change, the course of the world can change. This is a hope worth sustaining. I wish to thank a number of people for their support of and contribution to the effort involved in writing this book. Mostly I owe the reality of this book to my wife Amy, whose writing skill and phenomenal thought processes have put into this final form the content of my lectures, research, past writings, observations, and formulations, many of which we worked out together. Evidences of her philosophical, theological, and literary researches are sprinkled throughout the book, and the chapter on moral values is her original contribution. Also I express appreciation to my secretaries Beverly Fleming and Connie Drury, who prepared the typescript and study copies of the manuscript, to Alice Billings, Merrill Heidig, Jean Lee, Marjorie Marshall, and Jan Root for their valuable assistance, to my children for their delightful contribution. To my colleagues who joined me in founding the Institute for Transactional Analysis, Dr. Gordon Hayberg, Dr. Erwin Eckhorn, Dr. Bruce Marshall, Rev. J. Weaver Hess, and John R. Saldine, to the directors who joined us as the Institute Board expanded, Dr. David Applegate, Laverne Kreitz, Mrs. Donis Eckhorn, Dr. Ronald Fong, Dr. Alvin Freed, David Hill, Dr. Dennis Marks, Larry Mart, Dr. John Mitchell, Richard Nicholson, Rev. Russell Osneys, Dr. Warren Prentice, Burton Root, Barry Rumbles, Frank Summers, Rev. Ira Tanner, Leroy Wolder, and Dr. Z.O. Young. To the late Rev. Dr. Robert R. Ferguson, Senior Pastor of Fremont Presbyterian Church of Sacramento and consultant in field education at Princeton Theological Seminary, to Dr. John M. Campbell, Chairman of the Department of Anthropology at the University of New Mexico, to James J. Brown of the Sacramento Bee, to Eric Bjork for wisdom and generous commentary, to Dr. Ford Lewis, Minister of the First Unitarian Society of Sacramento, whose devotion to truth and compassion has been a rich source of encouragement. To Dr. Elton Trueblood, Professor of Philosophy at Earlham College, for the significant new data he made available to me, to Bishop James Pike, resident theologian at the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions at Santa Barbara, for his contagious enthusiasm and generous assistance, to two special persons who provided years of training and stimulation, Dr. Frieda Fromm-Reichmann and Dr. Harry Stack Sullivan, in whose tutelage I first heard the term interpersonal transactions. And finally to my patients, whose creative and emancipated thinking has provided much of the content of this book. It is at their request that I have written it. TAH. Institute for Transactional Analysis, Sacramento, California, June, 1968.